The subcommittee will come to order. Before I get into the substance of this morning's hearings, I just want to use a moment to note and call to the attention of the American people what I consider the bizarre behavior of the Bush administration. For some time, members of Congress have been asking to be briefed on the situation of the alleged Syrian nuclear reactor that was being built and reportedly destroyed by Israel. Most of us got no information whatsoever, no member of this committee, certainly, that is on the committee today. And finally, we have arranged a hearing, a briefing by the agencies. And before any of us was given any information and prior to the briefing, suddenly there appears in our nation's premier newspapers this morning information that the administration has chosen to selectively put out, even before members of Congress and chairmen of committees were able to see this. This is the selective control of information that led us into the war in Iraq. An administration that thinks it can selectively control information, put out the information it wants to put out, and hide the other information that it has. This is not an identical situation, but yet another example of the kinds of frightening Orwellian behavior that the Bush administration has exhibited, and why members of Congress in even greater numbers are not even going to classified briefings. Because after the classified briefing, you're told you can't talk about what you heard in the briefing. And then sometimes there's a clouding of the mind. Did you read that in the morning's paper with everybody else, or did you hear it at the briefing? So many members want to be free to criticize the administration and do not attend the briefings. And then we don't get all of the information at the briefings that are even in the newspaper reports, that are sometimes a lot more accurate and more comprehensive. And to my knowledge, none of the reporters on either of the papers here in Washington that are reporting the story this morning have security clearances of any kind, and yet staff members and committee staff members who have top clearances in the Congress of the United States are denied access to the briefings, and yet information is given out selectively to the press. I just thought somebody should note that this morning while all this is happening. And now for the substance of the matter. Sometime not too long ago, I asked a U.S. ambassador serving in the Middle East about what our Syria policy was. He was a clever diplomat and an honest person, and he chuckled, and he said to me that that answer would have to come at a later date. It's a very amusing but a troubling anecdote. Syria may be an economic backwater and an autocratic desert of cheap concrete and crumbling past glories, but it remains a key actor in the Middle East, and one that has, for the duration of the Bush administration, been getting away with murder. That's not a figure of speech. During the Bush administration, Damascus has literally been getting away with murder. Syria has been facilitating the movement of jihadis in Iraq who are killing our troops and murdering innocent Iraqis. Syria facilitated the movement of jihadis into Lebanon, armed them, and set them to make war against the Lebanese state. Many brave Lebanese soldiers and Palestinian refugees died in fighting in Nar al-Bared in order to preserve Lebanon's sovereignty. Together with Iran, Syria is responsible for the arming and rearming of Hezbollah, a terrorist group that started a war with Israel in 2006 and then hid behind civilian skirts, leading to billions of dollars of destruction in Lebanon and hundreds of innocent deaths, both in Lebanon and in Israel. In defiance of UN Security Council mandates, Syria is continuing to provide arms and facilitate the movement of arms, from Iran to Hezbollah in order to facilitate that group's efforts to undermine Lebanon's sovereignty and independence. In its attempt to restore Lebanon to its previous position as Syria's footstool, Damascus has almost certainly been responsible for the wave of murders of Lebanon's pro-independence leaders, beginning in 2005 with Rafiq Hariri, and including cabinet ministers, parliamentarians, prominent journalists, and dozens of innocent civilians. Today, as has been the case since November 2007, Lebanon's government remains without a president and unable to resolve its political crisis because too many Lebanese in positions of power, namely the leaders of Hezbollah, Amal, and the cult of Aoun, are more committed to the interests of Syria, Iran, and themselves than they are to their own country. Syria may be counting on its continued ability to make trouble and to upset the situation in Lebanon as leverage to avoid accountability. They are deluding themselves if they think so. Some, including a prominent U.S. senator, have suggested that Syria needs to be appeased by watering down or even neutering the UN Security Council mandated special tribunal for Lebanon. Damascus, they say, has to be recognized as a power, and then we have to acknowledge their interests in Lebanon. The past is the past, they say. Let the living not suffer for the dead. It's tempting to believe, but it's not true. Peace cannot be purchased by rewarding aggression. There will be no deal with the dictator in Damascus. Lebanon is not for sale, and justice is not a commodity in which the United States should trade. The special tribunal will proceed, and the guilty will pay for their crimes. Neither bombs, nor threats, nor hollow promises of peace will avert the justice that is coming. The Assad regime must know that salvation will not come from well-intentioned American politicians ready to sell the freedoms of others to buy the illusion of security for themselves. The future of U.S.-Syrian relations remains to be written. This is because so much of it will change within the next few years. There will be a change of administration in the United States. There will have to be elections in Lebanon in 2009, and the special tribunal will do its work with who knows what consequences. The next president will not start with a clean sheet, but nonetheless will certainly have to make a fresh start. Our current policy is not to have a policy. Instead, we have a shopping list of behaviors we want Syria to change. Yet again, the Bush administration has chosen hope and prayer as an alternative to strategy. So what should the next administration seek from Syria? What is possible? The answer depends chiefly on how the next president decides a key question. Can the marriage between Damascus and Tehran be broken up, or are these two parties too committed to a shared vision of Middle East restored to their liking, recorded to their liking? Many analysts believe that the relationship between Iran and Syria is purely tactical and a transactional one. Implicit in this belief is the idea that if only the United States would make Syria an offer of sufficient size and sweetness, the axis from Tehran to Damascus could be shattered and the Middle East transformed. Syria, in this view, might even join our team. In exchange for the return of the Golan Heights and the restoration of its overlordship of Lebanon, Syria would renege on its relationship with Hezbollah, give Hamas the boot, and slam the door shut on Iran. The mullahs would be cut off from their Lebanese and Palestinian terrorist proxies and isolated completely in the region. The flow of jihadis from Syria would dry up, perhaps in return for a restoration of Saddam's old largesse with Iraq's oil, and the situation in Iraq would settle down, further isolating Iran from the Arab hinterland. Faced with the united Middle East, the Ayatollahs would set their dreams of hegemony and Islamic revolution aside and give up their nuclear program in exchange for international security guarantees. It's a nice story, but I'm not convinced. It sounds lovely, and it has a sort of logic to it, but it is a fantasy. The relationship between Iran and Syria is long-standing, durable, and is based on a bedrock of shared interests. This relationship is meant to fulfill each party's deepest strategic aspirations and regional ambitions. Neither state wishes to live as a second-class citizen in a Middle East organized and run by Washington, Cairo, and Riyadh. They have bigger dreams, and it is these dreams against which we must struggle. A deal with Syria and Iran may be possible, but I sincerely doubt that it can be bought or sustained by sacrificing others or by offering just carrots and no sticks. It should go without saying that a deal would also mean some kind of purposeful and principled engagement. We shouldn't expect either Syria or Iran to get on their knees, and there is certainly no need for us to do so either. Engagement is not synonymous with capitulation. A peaceful Middle East may or may not be possible, but it cannot be achieved solely by holding our breath, demanding obedience, or sending in the Marines. It is more than past time for the United States to get back into the foreign policy business. We could start by having a Syria policy again. Chair recognizes Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I also want to echo your initial comments and the concerns that as members of Congress representing the American people, in order for us to be able to make intelligent decisions on foreign policy, we have the necessary information available to us, whether it's dealing with North Korea, which has a great deal of nuclear weapons, or whether it's Syria, which was apparently attempting to develop a nuclear weapons program, as well as other countries in the Middle East. So it's of great concern that we read these stories in the New York Times or other newspapers around the country before we even get briefed or before even a classified briefing or any type of briefing arises, because these are essential questions of how we decide to deal with North Korea or how we decide to deal with Syria. That being said, I appreciate the Chair's comments and his perceptions of how this is playing out, and of course look forward to the comments of our panel this morning, and thank you for being here to share your information, your perspectives. My questions obviously relate to the nature of the continued responsibility that Syria has for arming Hezbollah and for weapons getting into the northern or the southern border of Lebanon, and how that is going to impact the continuing dealings with Israel. Obviously, what happened there over the last couple of years was tragic on many levels, but it was fueled by this funneling of resources and weapons, just like we have in the Gaza Strip right now. So I'm interested in what your views are in terms of the status of that whole arrangement and what can and should be done in dealing with that. It continues to be a military buildup, it appears, and there doesn't seem to be any check and balance to making sure that those rockets don't get into Lebanon. And of course, as the Chairman already pointed out, what is this juxtaposition of Syria's role? How can it be, as it has been expressed on the one hand, that Syria can possibly be isolated based on their religious views and their identity of who they would relate to, whether it's Iran, or they can be brought into some type of relationship with other countries to isolate Iran. Obviously, one big goal we have is dealing with Iran. That's the largest point for many of us in isolating and making Iran feel the brunt of recognition that it is on its own and that its behavior is unacceptable. But Syria, as a continued client state and relationship that's there, isn't changing any of that, and Iran continues to use Syria for dealing with a lot of the other problems in that region. So I'd be interested in hearing, as the Chairman already expressed, your views on what can be done and should be done by the United States government and its relations with our allies in that region to deal with Syria and Iran in that regard. So, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to the comments this morning and appreciate your calling this meeting.
Thank you. Mr. Costa.
Thank you as well, Mr. Chairman, for I think what is an important and timely hearing. I have to be on the floor at 10 o'clock, so I want to defer my time to our witnesses so that they can inform us of their position. I will observe very briefly that In conversations that a number of us have had with former Secretary of State Jim Baker, his comment about the need to continue to have dialogue with the Syrians, as he says, 16 visits before he finally was able to reach some breakthrough on issues of interest, I think are important. I think we have to continue to, notwithstanding the fact that we have tremendous differences, continue to maintain the dialogue. Certainly what took place last year with North Korea and Syria attempting to develop a nuclear facility that apparently was eliminated continues to, I think, draw the target on the country of Syria as to what their true intentions are in the region and whether or not they intend to play any sort of constructive role. There's a lot of questions I have about this regime and what continues to keep it sustaining. So I will look forward to the testimony, and hopefully we'll get some additional insight in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We do indeed this morning have quite a remarkable panel of experts, starting with Ambassador Martin Indyk, who is the director of the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings Institution. During the Clinton administration, Ambassador Indyk served 2 tours as U.S. ambassador to Israel, worked as senior director of the Near East, South Asian Affairs at the National Security Council, was appointed Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs. Before entering government service, Ambassador Indyk served for 8 years as founding executive director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He has taught at the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies, Columbia University, Tel Aviv University, and others. With us also is Amar Abdul-Hamid, who is the executive director and founder of the Tharwa Foundation, a U.S.-based 501c3 organization established to facilitate the process of democratization and modernization in Syria through a variety of educational programs, popular dialogues, and grassroots initiatives. In September '05, Mr. Abdul-Hamid was forced to leave Syria due to his political activism. In the U.S., he has served as a fellow at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution and at the International Institute for Modern Letters in Las Vegas. While still in Syria, Mr. Abdul-Hamid authored a number of literary works, including a novel and a volume of poetry. He and his work have been featured in Newsweek, The Washington Post, Christian Science Monitor, New York Times, and Salon Magazine. Dr. Peter Rodman is a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Rodman joined Brookings in March 2007 after nearly 6 years as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs in the Bush administration. He has served 5 presidential administrations, including in such positions as a Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs during the George H.W. Bush administration, and as Director of the State Department's Policy Planning Staff during the Reagan presidency. He began his government service at the White House as a Special Assistant to Henry Kissinger on the National Security Council staff. We will begin with Ambassador Indyk. Without objection, everybody's complete statements will be placed in the record, and you may proceed as you will.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to appear before you and your committee again.
Could you pull the microphone just a tiny bit closer?
I said thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me to address your committee again today. As Mr. Klein and Mr. Costa pointed out, it's a very timely hearing given the way in which Syria has suddenly become in the news. But as you point out, Mr. Chairman, the issue of policy towards Syria is something that hasn't had a lot of attention in the past 8 years. I think it's fair to say that there's been an intense disagreement between Syria and the United States over policy towards Iraq, policy towards Lebanon, and policy towards Israel during the period of the Bush administration. And the dominant view of Syria, one that you've given eloquent expression to today, has developed in Washington, that it's a country ruled by an unreliable leader expressing its ruthless ambition to dominate its smaller Lebanese neighbor, harboring Palestinian terrorists and Iraqi insurgents, and of course, from a strategic point of view, most importantly, maintaining an alliance with Iran, which is a strategic adversary of the United States in the region. And so I think that the Bush administration's basic approach has been to try to isolate Syria and contain its negative influences in its neighborhood, with Syria subject to a range of sanctions that are designed to try to punish Syria for its untoward behavior. I think the results of this policy are mixed at best. Syria has managed to prevent the election of a new Lebanese president, and in the process has kind of stymied Lebanese politics to the advantage of its local Lebanese allies, Hezbollah and some Christian factions. It has, of course, facilitated the rearming of Hezbollah to pre-2006 war levels, provides safe haven and succor to Hamas and Palestine Islamic Jihad, or PIJ, Palestinian terrorist groups that are engaged in violent opposition to the Annapolis peace process. And as Amar, my colleague here today, can attest, it suppresses all political dissent inside Syria. But on the other side, and there is another side, Syria, for the time being, seems to be cooperating with the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. It has attenuated its support for Iraqi insurgents. And President Assad continues to assert his interest in making peace with Israel, only this week stating again his desire for peace with Israel. And of course, the Syrians turned up in Annapolis for the Annapolis Peace Conference. And he's been very careful not to provoke any confrontation with Israel or even retaliate for what appears to have been Israel's strike on Syria's clandestine nuclear facility. The question that I gathered you wanted to address today, Mr. Chairman, was what are the options that the next President of the United States is going to face when he or she decides to address the problem of what to do about Syria. And in essence, since Syria is a rogue regime for the reasons I've suggested, the options boil down to three. There are always three. The first is regime change, try to remove the rogue regime. The second is containment and isolation and sanctions to try to reduce its negative influence and try to induce more positive behavior. And the third is a policy of engagement designed to try through negotiations and some mix of positive incentives as well as maintenance of sanctions to try to encourage a better approach. Now, I think that the next president should actually pursue the third option, and that's the one that I want to focus on today for a few minutes. That is the option of engagement. And there are two essential drivers for this approach. The first is Israel and the second is Iran. The government of Israel is keenly interested in engaging Syria in peace negotiations. We have stories in the Israeli press over the last 2 days which indicate that Prime Minister Olmert has conveyed to President Assad through the Turkish government his willingness to withdraw from the Golan Heights. And he has made clear in his own public interviews recently, but he's been saying this for some 6 months, that he wants to engage in peace negotiations with Syria. The fact that the Syrians are also expressing a similar interest means that there is in fact an opportunity here. And for the United States not to seek to exploit that opportunity puts it in the invidious position of apparently opposing peace between Israel and the last of its Arab state neighbors, large Arab state neighbors with significant military capability, that appears to want to make peace with Israel. The second driver, as I say, is Iran. Iran has managed to raise itself to the level of a strategic adversary of the United States in the region. And the challenge of dealing with Iran's nuclear ambitions, its efforts to promote its sphere of influence in Iraq, and its interference both in Lebanon and in the Palestinian arena, the challenge of dealing with that multifaceted challenge to our interests from Iran requires us to look at Syria and to see what we can do in terms of affecting the relationship between Iran and Syria. Because, to put it very simply, Syria is the conduit, the pipeline, by which Iran is able to spread its influence to Lebanon and to the Palestinian arena and interfere in our efforts in both. To use the peace process, as it were, to take Syria out of the conflict with Israel and to try to drive a wedge between Syria and Iran is, it seems to me, in the interests of the United States, if such an opportunity exists. And certainly, as I suggested, Israel, the governments of Israel and Syria are now making very clear that such an opportunity does exist. I think the Bush administration has been loath to engage in this effort to promote an Israeli-Syrian negotiation, essentially because it would undermine its policy of isolation and containment. But I think more importantly, the Bush administration is concerned that it would, in the process, end up sacrificing Lebanon's independence on the altar of an Israeli-Syrian peace. And that, as you yourself made very clear, Mr. Chairman, is not something that the United States can be in the business of endorsing. As you said, Lebanon is not for sale. And the great fear is that somehow the Israeli-Syrian deal will undermine our efforts to maintain Lebanon's independence. I think that we have a different way of engaging the Syrians and protecting Lebanon at the same time, and that a process that is designed to explore Israeli-Syrian peace can actually, with the US involved, can actually serve to protect Lebanon's interests rather than undermine them. I say that because the Syrians will not sit down with the Israelis unless the United States is in the room. That is their, as it were, precondition now. But we can have our own precondition, that we will only engage in promoting Israeli-Syrian negotiations if it's understood by Syria and Israel that Lebanon is off the table, that Lebanon is not part of this negotiation. And during the negotiation, we're also, by being inside the room, in a position to insist that as part of the peace deal between Israel and Syria, Syria end its support for Hezbollah, end the arms flow into Lebanon. Such an engagement via the peace process has a number of other advantages as well. It would help facilitate Israeli-Palestinian negotiations because it would put pressure on Hamas and Palestine Islamic Jihad, which are based in Damascus, which are the strongest Palestinian opponents of the peace process that we're now trying to pursue there. It would give greater political cover for the necessary compromises that the Palestinians and Israelis would have to make to reach a deal, because the Syrians would be involved in negotiations as well. And it would give the United States, the next president, the opportunity, in effect, to play one track off against the other, a kind of synergy that we were able to take advantage of during the Clinton years when we had negotiations on the Syrian track as well as the Palestinian track. But I think the most important reason for the United States engaging Syria via a peace process is, as I said, Iran. And I have no doubt, based again on my experience during the Clinton years, that it would spook the Iranians. I don't believe it's possible simply to flip Syria out of its alliance with Iran. I think you're right, Mr. Chairman, to suggest that there are common interests there, that they are strategic allies, and that it's facile to imagine that you can somehow, through engagement, change that reality. But what you can do, and what will be a natural outcome of an Israeli-Syrian negotiation, is to create tension between Iran and Syria, because the Iranians see Syrian engagement with Israel as advancing a Pax Americana, which they see as threatening their strategic interests in the region. And as the foreign minister of Iran at the time in 1990 said, the more a country gets close to the usurper regime, he of course was referring to Israel, the more it will distance itself from us. That is the way the Iranians view this. It's a zero-sum game. And so I think that the greatest benefit here in engaging with Syria is the tension it creates. The Iranians will be concerned precisely that their pipeline to the Middle East heartland will be constricted as a result of this negotiation. And in the broader context of our approach to Iran, it serves our interests to create some uncertainty about its ability to depend on its Syrian ally. I'll end it there, Mr. Chairman, because I know you want to get on with the other presentations, and just emphasize that I think a policy of engagement with our eyes open, with our awareness of the nature and interests of the Syrian regime, with an effort to ensure that Lebanon's independence is maintained, and with a valid skepticism about the nature and intentions of what the Syrians are up to, nevertheless can serve American interests.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Abdul Hamid.
Chairman Ackerman, distinguished subcommittee members, I would like to thank you for this opportunity to testify here today. Change in Syria is not a matter of if anymore, but of when, how, and who. Facts and factors influencing and dictating change are already in progress and are, for the most part, the product of internal dynamics rather than external influences. The dynamics are those of daily life. According to recent reports, 40% of Syria's population, that is 8 million people, live on less than $2 a day. Unemployment is at an all-time high, and inflation rates are astronomical. Government policies, corruption, and mismanagement have exacerbated the situation, forcing people to organize around local issues and begin to agitate. Albeit this agitation is not yet anti-regime per se, that is, it is not yet, no one is yet demanding the ouster of the current president, it is indeed anti-establishment. That is, it's clearly aimed against official lies and impunity. This phenomena is still in its embryonic phase and might take years before it produces a real challenge to the regime. But it is a serious phenomena, and the regime is treating it as such. Many local activists are arrested every day. Many communities are seething with anger, and there seems to be a revolution lurking under the cinders in many localities, as one activist put it. At a number of occasions, people demonstrated in front of the presidential palace in Damascus, but their concerns were never addressed. As a result, they have grown disillusioned with Bashar al-Assad himself. The starkest expression of this disillusionment came on May 27, 2007, when most Syrians boycotted the presidential referendum. The lavish celebrations that were orchestrated at the time and the massive spending involved caused mass indignation, as they coincided with times of great economic hardship for most Syrians. The referendum was nothing more than an act of a political striptease, at the end of which the president shed his last reformist fig leaf. As a result, the internal popular debate that followed the elections shifted from a discussion of reform to a discussion of which marks the better strategy, challenging the system head-on or indirectly. For many, the answer lay with the Damascus Declaration, a document woven together by opposition members from diverse backgrounds back in October of 2005. The ranks of the declaration swelled after the referendum, and on December 1st, 2007, they elected what amounts to be a shadow government, made up of mostly liberal elements. The ruling regime was quick to respond, and over the next few days proceeded to arrest all 12 members of the Damascus Declaration General Council, among others. The move did not surprise the rank and file. Everyone expected the arrests. The point of the election was not to rebel-rouse, but to demonstrate the movement's strong commitment to democratic principles, and to give the world a glimpse of what kind of government would emerge in Syria when she holds free elections one day. Meanwhile, the ruling regime continues to be preoccupied with its growing troubles with the international community, and decision-making continues to be a family affair. For the Assad regime is a multi-headed monster where decisions can only be made by consensus. But as the president, Bashar al-Assad has had greater influence in shaping the policies of the regime. Bashar's thinking is shaped by two major trends: his fascination with the personality of Hassan Nasrallah and his belief in the greater Syria ideology. This is why he could not come to an agreement with former Lebanese PM Rafiq al-Hariri, who was pushing for a more normal relationship between Syria and Lebanon. And this is why he elevated the status of Hezbollah from a simple card in his hand to a full-fledged strategic partner. Furthermore, the Assad-Nasrallah connection plays an important role in facilitating the continuing development of Syria's relations with Iran's hardliners. Some members of the Assad family are rumored to favor more equal relationship with Iran. But should Bashar continue to have his way, Syria's relationship with Iran will increasingly resemble Lebanon's own relationship with Syria back in the 80s and 90s. In effect, Bashar al-Assad is Iran's Emil Lahoud. But the main problem that the Assads have to contend with today are still by far the international tribunal. In this regard, the Assad strategy is to shift international attention back to the issue of the Golan Heights. But they will be conducting peace talks while their eyes are on the tribunal. Only when the tribunal issue becomes moot can peace have a real chance at being concluded. But since no one can afford to sabotage the workings of the tribunal, the desire of the Assad seems to represent a pretty tall order and might just trump any attempt at successful engagement. So what can the United States do, especially at a time when many experts are convinced that engagement can work or that it should at least be given another chance? The answer is simple. By all means, give engagement another chance. But in order for the United States to avoid becoming a partner in the crimes perpetrated against the Syrian people, a clear element of conditionality should be inserted at the very beginning, namely the release of all political prisoners. In exchange, the United States could send its ambassador back to Damascus, initiating a series of quid pro quos that could help the Assads break out of their old habits. In time, this process should be managed not to lead simply to the revival of the peace process between Syria and Israel, but more importantly, to launch of two more processes. One is the reconciliation process between Syria and Lebanon, for this is indeed the only logical way to stop the tribunal and without undermining the processes of international legitimacy. And two, an internal reconciliation process between the regime and its opponents. For this is what's really at stake here. In order for Syria to be at peace with its neighbors, it has really to be at peace with itself. Otherwise, it will continue to export its troubles abroad. That will entail this kind of reconciliation, of course, agreeing on a new constitution and free parliamentary and presidential elections. The Assad may not end up controlling or leading the system, but they will be part of it, and they will have evaded the indignity of prosecution. Should this prove to be insufficient for the Assads, should the Assads refuse to cooperate in such a plan, then they will have earned their continued isolation, and U.S. policymakers could then decide and weigh in the other options, continued isolation or regime change. But for now, U.S. policymakers should not be preoccupied with what the Assads will or won't accept, since every iota of evidence we have indicates that they crave something they can never have and no one can ever give to them. As such, the Assads need a reality check. They need to realize that there is no avoiding the linkage between their internal and external woes, and that they need to reform their ways both at home and abroad in order to ensure their political survival. In the meantime, the U.S. should not shy away from actively supporting the country's opposition groups and dissidents, especially those with established connections to the grassroots and who are reaching out to the United States. No, this will not mark the kiss of death for them, especially when put in the context highlighted above. In fact, many of the country's leading dissidents, members of the Damascus Declaration itself, will be holding a meeting here in this very building tomorrow to ask for your support. In many ways, when the United States what the United States need to communicate to the Syrians and is a message of hope and change, and a message of hope and change, not a message of hope and the status quo, or surely not a message of hope and the status quo ante. The good old days are gone. They can never come back. They were never good anyway. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Rodman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for your courtesy this morning. Syria, you have my you have my prepared statement, and I would just like to make a couple of key points, if I may. Syria is in the news, of course, for two reasons. One is the nuclear business with North Korea. The second is a wave of recent press accounts, which Martin Indyk alluded to, of Syrian-Israeli diplomatic contacts. And these diplomatic contacts have been essentially confirmed by both sides, and that is what I would like to focus on in my remarks. My main point is that we and Israel should not forget that Syria has a regional importance. I don't think that's likely to be forgotten, but Syria is an essentially weak country that has made itself a major factor in the Arab world by its unholy alliance with Iran, by a pattern of behavior that is menacing. It has given itself leverage and regional status by this disruptive behavior. And this is a strategic problem. It goes beyond the Middle East peace process. It certainly goes beyond the bilateral issue of Israeli-Syrian relations, and it goes beyond, I think the importance goes beyond that of the Golan Heights. The chairman's opening statement correctly listed a lot of the examples of Syrian misbehavior. The chairman is absolutely right that in Iraq, the Syrians are actively colluding with Iraqi extremists who are killing Americans. That may have subsided somewhat, but my understanding is that the Syrians are cracking down on Islamist forces within Syria, and what we see along the Iraqi border may be some fallout from this, rather than any kind of Syrian strategic decision to stop its mischievous behavior in Iraq. Lebanon has been alluded to by everyone. The Syrian, even as we speak, is playing the same disruptive role, attempting to regain its dominance that it had lost. And most importantly, the alliance with Iran. Now, so the question we and Israel need to think about, if there were to be a negotiation over the Golan Heights, the question we need to ask ourselves a number of questions. What is the effect of such a negotiation on these regional interests that we both have? Now, there are serious arguments, there are good arguments for eagerly pursuing a Syrian-Israeli negotiation. Ehud Barak has been quoted recently as saying, well, Israel wants to pin down stability on the northern front, which helps isolate the Palestinians. It helps consolidate one part of Israel's security while Israel turns to other more difficult issues. That's a good argument. I heard Yitzhak Rabin make the same point 15 years ago when there was an earlier phase of Syrian-Israeli diplomacy. But I have some questions. I mean, what if there were to be a deal or a negotiation? What does it mean for Lebanon? Martin mentioned that too. What assurances do we have that Syria will not continue to wage war against Israel by proxy via Lebanon, which it has been doing? Will that be part of the discussion? What effect will it have on Syria's behavior in the region? And will it loosen its ties with Iran or not? I'm not so sure. In fact, to put it in a nutshell, the Gulf Arabs, who are our allies with respect to Iran are very angry at Syria right now. Syria is isolated in the Arab world, and my concern is that one of Syria's motives for these peace overtures with Israel is to break free of its isolation, complicate our relations with our Gulf Arab friends, which is a strategic cost to us. And in fact, Israel has improving relations with a number of the Gulf Arabs, and the question is this consistent? And will it have the strategic benefit of separating Syria from Iran, or will it be a clever device by Syria to break out of its isolation while feeling free to continue its hostile actions in Lebanon or Iraq or with respect to Iran? So my bottom line is, first of all, that the United States and Israel need to coordinate closely if there is to be a Syrian diplomacy. But secondly, the United States and Israel, as they coordinate, need to keep the broader regional context in mind. Iran, Lebanon, Iraq. And we must not lose sight of what we want Syria to do. We know what price Syria is asking for. They want the Golan back. But we need to keep in mind the price we have a right to demand. What we want from Syria is a change of behavior on the range of things that the chairman discussed. And before we lift a finger on Syria's behalf, I would like some assurance that we're going to get some of the things we want out of Syria. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank the entire panel for your testimony. If Syria's big ask is the Golan, what's the trade? What is it that we can reasonably expect? Do we have a long list, a short list, a comprehensive list? Ambassador?
Well, if you allow me, I'm not sure that that's the extent of its ask in the first place. So if we're going to look at what the trade is, I think the ask includes the Golan and all of the Golan, but it also extends to Lebanon. I think that if you go back to the negotiations that we conducted in the 1990s, when the circumstances were very different, Lebanon was indeed part of the deal. Syria was in those days in Lebanon, was exercising some kind of control. It had been invited into Lebanon by the United States as a way of preventing the civil war or stopping the civil war from going on there. So it had a position of dominance in Lebanon. And the assumption in those days when we had, the last time we had intensive Israeli-Syrian negotiations with American participation, was that as part of the Israel-Syria deal, Syria would disarm Hezbollah in Lebanon, using its troop presence there to do so, and would oversee an Israel-Lebanon peace agreement that would be the outgrowth of the Israeli-Syrian deal. In other words, in those days, it was accepted by all parties involved that the deal would involve all of the Golan in return for Syria ending its conflict with Israel, normalizing relations with Israel, and getting recognition, in effect, for its control of Lebanon.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
For its control of Lebanon. That would be as part of the deal. The Israel-Lebanon peace deal would have been done under Syrian auspices. Now, we're in a very different situation today. As I said, and you said it much more clearly, Lebanon cannot be part of this deal. So, what are they? That's what they want is Lebanon and the Golan Heights. What they can get, the Israelis, not just this prime minister, but 5 previous prime ministers have offered Syria full Israeli withdrawal from the Golan, so they can get that. What we need in return is Lebanon off the table, an end to Syria's using its territory as a through point for arming Hezbollah and other groups in Lebanon as well, and a shutting down of those terrorist organizations which Syria hosts in Damascus, which most important of which are Hamas and Palestine Islamic Jihad, which have their headquarters there. So I think that's the trade that we would need to see there. I don't think that it makes sense to add to that requirement that it break its relationship with Iran. I rather believe that that will be the natural outgrowth of a peace deal between Israel and Syria under American auspices.
Mr. Abdulhamid?
I actually did not hear the word tribunal, so I have to say it's not the Golan. It's nothing. They want the end of the tribunal. This is a major concern, and everything they've been doing over the last couple of years have really pointed in this direction. So as such, you can conduct peace, you can demand whatever you want from them, but you really have to think: can you give them what they want in this regard? And the only way you can actually promise them that is to actually get them to sit with the Lebanese and to get, as I said, some kind of an agreement between the Syrians and the Lebanese. So the reality is you cannot just think anymore of the Golan separately or of this entire dynamics of Israel and Syrian talking separately from Syrian and Lebanese talking also. There are three processes of national conciliations that have to be taken, or peace processes that need to take place. One between Syria and Lebanon, because if Lebanon then are satisfied, if they get what they want, which is diplomatic exchange for Syria, lesser interference by Syrians in their internal affairs, so on, they might be able to then go to and demand from the United Nations a new resolution and then this whole investigation. That's the only legal way really out of this. But they are not going to do it at this stage with Syria holding the gun and with Hezbollah basically parading in the streets and establishing a state within a state. So all of these issues are interconnected: the Golan, the internal situation in Lebanon. And what I'm trying to also insert here into the discussion is something that is always missing from the discussion, is the question of human rights and the troubles within Syria itself, because they can erupt at any moment. The situation is that tenuous. People, when they walk in the street, or when I read some of the how the press reports on Syria these days, they look at the surface. They don't really see what's happening on the ground. They look and say, hey, we can buy an iPhone in Syria, so the situation must be good. But what they don't miss is the fact that or a cellular phone, basically, or whatever technological device. Everything is available, indeed, in the country, but those who can afford it are less than 10% or 5% of the population. On the other hand, the basic foodstuffs have risen by a factor of 200 and 300% over the last couple of months alone. People, as I said, 8 million live below the poverty line. They are in dire need, and they are seething with anger, and troubles have already begun taking place in different parts of Syria as a result of that. So what you might end up having is a situation, and of course activists and dissidents are being interrogated and cracked and jailed every day and tortured. There were reported deaths under torture a few days ago, and also there were demonstrations in Kurdish areas a couple of weeks ago that led to gunfire by the authorities, and several people were killed. So the situation is pretty tenuous in some areas, and what you can end up have at any moment is a collapse of the situation. So therefore you have to think of that third dynamic, which is Syria has to resolve its internal problems as well. So these issues are connected: the internal situation, the Golan, and the tribunal relations.
Let me just, is economic unrest in Syria a good thing or a bad thing?
It is both, in a sense that it's a good thing because people are beginning to listen to the opposition for the first time in a long time, and opposition is beginning to develop a grassroots support So in that sense, it's good because democracy is getting now a chance, and people are beginning to think that we need to challenge the regime and look for alternatives. The bad thing about it, however, is that even when the system changes, it's going to take many, many years until we rectify the disaster that has been created to us by the Assads due to their mismanagement and corruption. So, and a lot of people are suffering in the meantime.
Dr. Rodman?
I'd like to answer the chairman's question
Yeah.
With 3 points, very bluntly. One, I don't see Syria giving up what has been, up to now, the essence of its whole foreign policy for almost 40 years, namely playing the spoiler role, holding hostages in Lebanon, if you will, holding Lebanon as a hostage, using Iraq as leverage against the United States, and of course this alliance with Iran, which gives it leverage over its Arab brothers. Without this foreign policy, Syria is a weak little country, and an very ordinary country, and I don't see Syria having any interest in giving up this leverage it has. Second, I believe Syria's motive now is to use the United States and Israel to break out of the isolation which it is now feeling in the Arab world. As the Arab-Iranian rivalry heats up, Syria is under pressure from the Arabs, and this Israeli overture is a way, I think, to use us to break free of that and to drive a wedge, in fact, between us and our Gulf Arab friends. And three, just the bottom line, I am very skeptical about the strategic benefit now of taking the bait and pursuing a Golan negotiation.
So if the current culture question was deal or no deal, you would say no deal?
I think we should be very, very cautious, and we should have a long list of the demands we make on Syria before we expose ourselves to the risks that I've described.
Let's say we put together a comprehensive list of what our demands are, starting with everything that everybody has said, from ending their relationship with Iran, to not meddling in the Middle East, to not running guns and jihadis from Iran to Iraq, to human rights within Syria, economic reforms within Syria, no longer supporting terrorist organizations and Hezbollah, taking Lebanon off the table. What do they get for all that? I mean, how did
basically, I'll say they get immunity from prosecution in the tribunal. They get a new lease on life. That's what they get. I mean, because
you're giving them Lebanon.
No, not Lebanon. We are giving them their political survival inside Syria.
Ambassador?
I disagree with my friend Amar here. I don't think it's any of our business to be offering deals on the tribunal or going along with deals on the tribunal. Tribunal is a judicial process under UN resolutions. And our position should be we don't have anything to do with that. We don't have any control over that. That is something that is a judicial process which we will not interfere in. And it will have to play itself out according to the evidence and the indictments and the prosecutions and the findings of the tribunal. So I don't see that that's something we should be giving on. But I wonder if I could just prolong the conversation with Peter Rodman about the dangers of the deal that you're exploring here, because I think there's no doubt that the downside here is that the Syrians break out of their isolation. But I think that he misinterprets the Arab concern here. The Arabs, particularly the Saudis, are very upset about Syria's policies in Lebanon. But the Saudis and the other Arab states insisted that we get the Syrians to come to Annapolis. Why do they do that? Because they want Syrian political cover for their own engagement with Israel. And I think their strategic interest is very similar to ours. In order their interest is to bring the Syrians over from the Iranian side of the equation to the Arab side of the balance of power. Now, they're very realistic about how that can be done, but that's their long-term objective. So I don't see that we're at loggerheads with them here. But we do place ourselves at loggerheads with our Israeli ally if we're not prepared to help it when it wants to explore the potential for peace with Syria. The last point I'd like to make, Mr. Chairman, is it's important to understand that peace is not about to break out between Israel and Syria. The deal is not about to be done, in which we put our list down and they say, yes, sir. This will be, because it is the Syrians involved, it will be a prolonged negotiation. They have much more interest in a process, precisely because, as Peter says, they're trying to break out of their isolation, than they do in actually reaching an agreement. But what I'm trying to argue is that we have an interest in a process as well. A process can enable us to put those kinds of things on the table, enable us to engage with the Syrians in pressing those kinds of issues. With an ambassador back there, we can press, I think, more effectively the human rights agenda that Amar talks about. And most importantly of all, we can protect Lebanese independence. Because the great danger here of our standing back and in the cause of isolating Syria is that Syria will break out of its isolation via Israel anyway, because of the Israeli interest in doing this. The Israelis are already using the Turks instead of us to engage with the Syrians. And if the Israelis and the Syrians go off and make their own deal, there is a good chance that Lebanon's independence will be sacrificed. Why? Because the Israelis don't have a pony in the race in terms of Lebanese presidential politics or so on. What they care about is Hezbollah. Who's going to disarm Hezbollah and solidify the security arrangements on their northern border? And in order for that to be achieved, if Syria is going to do the job, the Israelis will be satisfied with that. And so I think there's a real downside to standing back at a point where the Israelis and Syrians want to engage.
I was going to move to Mr. Fortenberry, but I just want a clarification of what you're saying. The Israelis do not have the ability to deal anything on Lebanon, but they do have the ability to make a deal over the Golan. That they do not have a horse in the race vis-a-vis Lebanon, as you've described, does not mean that they can give Lebanon away. But are you suggesting that a deal with Israel and Syria should not be made sans our participation, so that we can leverage in a guarantee for Lebanon's independence? Is that what you're saying?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. I think just one point is that if you imagine yourself a fly on the wall in an Israeli-Syrian negotiation with the United States not present there, the Israeli demand to the Syrians will be, you have to shut down the Palestinian organizations and disarm Hezbollah. And the Syrians will say, okay, but to do that, we have to be able to move into Lebanon. And in order, if you want us to disarm Hezbollah, then that's going to be the requirement. We're going to have the ability to operate in Lebanon to disarm Hezbollah. That's the way it comes in.
So your cautionary note is not to be too encouraging of an independent, absent U.S. assistance agreement between Israel and Syria?
Look, there will not be an Israeli-Syrian deal without American involvement, so we don't need to be too nervous about this. The Syrians are the ones insisting on our presence there because they want to break out of isolation, as Peter says. But the Israelis will need our involvement as well because they can't do a Golan deal without kind of security assistance and underwriting that the United States, only the United States, can provide and has provided in every other deal that Israel has done with its Arab neighbors and the Palestinians. So we will be in the room if there's a real deal to be done.
I have, as you might know, a strong interest in Lebanese independence and do not want to leave that to chance.
And I say the best way to do that is to make it clear by being in the negotiations. We cannot put ourselves in a position of opposing Israeli-Syrian peace or not being involved in it. You know, it's an extremely awkward situation. And it is, Mr. Chairman, unprecedented. There's never been a case where we have not been willing to support Israel when it's making peace. But the way to protect Lebanon's independence is through the negotiations, is making clear that our involvement comes with that primary requirement.
I thank the committee's indulgence for the chair's overburdening use of the time. Mr. Fortenberry.
No, Mr. Chairman, it's very helpful. Thank you, and thank you all for appearing today. I'm sorry I didn't have the benefit of your earlier testimony, but let me try to catch up here. What would it take to leverage a change in Syria's internal calculus? Now, a primary motive that I've heard you say is its desire to end its isolation. We just heard in response to Dr. Rodman's assertion that we should be very cautious into entering any negotiations without a clear set of demands or important outcomes that we'd like to achieve. And as we tick through those demands, it's obviously clearly very complicated and would be a very heavy lift. So, what would motivate a change in the internal calculus that would allow Syria to end its isolation, become a part of the responsible community of nations, and achieve some of the key elements that were just listed there?
I'll start. I think Syria will calculate what the balance of forces is in the region, what the pressures are, what the incentives are. One of the factors, not the only factor, is American credibility and American strength. I think a big key to that is what the situation is in Iraq. If we look like we're being driven out of Iraq, our leverage collapses and others will see advantage. If we look like we're succeeding in Iraq, that does a lot to restore our credibility regionally. I mean, American credibility is not divisible, and I think our position in the whole region depends significantly on that. Now, that's just one factor, but again, Arab pressures on Syria are another factor. So I think Syria will calculate, as most countries do, where what the pressures are on it. And that's one of the things that makes me nervous. I think in the present environment of the last few years, I'm not sure the Syrians and Iranians think they're under a lot of pressure. And that's the worst context in which to undertake a negotiation.
I think actually that Peter should be claiming more success for the current administration's approach than he does. I think the Syrians are feeling already the cold wind of isolation, and they are not feeling particularly comfortable. In other words, I think their calculus has already been affected by our approach. But in terms of the situation in Iraq, I think the Syrians have come to the conclusion that it's in their own interests not to let that situation get out of control. They're not going to exert a lot of energy to help us there. But whereas they wanted us tied down and facing difficulties because they feared that if we succeeded in Iraq, we would turn our military power on them, I think they've come to understand that it doesn't serve their interest to keep on fueling the insurgency there. So, in other words, in some ways, we've already impacted their calculus. Their desire to break out of their isolation now is, I think, generated by an awkwardness that they feel as an Alawite regime, which is a small sect, kind of breakaway sect of Shiism, sitting atop a Sunni population in Syria. And as this sectarian rivalry between Shias and Sunnis spreads itself across the region, the Syrian regime finds itself in a somewhat awkward position, aligned with Shia Persian Iran against the emerging bloc of Sunni Arabs. And it creates, Mark can speak to this better than I can, but it creates a certain uneasiness that feeds already the indignation and anger that he has described. So for that reason, I think they would like to find a way to distance themselves somewhat from the embrace of the Iranians. And it's very interesting to see the way they have built their relationship with Turkey, their northern neighbor. They used to have very bad relations with Turkey. Part of the way they've tried to break out of the isolation that we've imposed on them is to build this relationship with Turkey, an ally of the United States, an ally of Israel, but it's Sunni as well. And it gives them a kind of relationship with a major Sunni power to reduce their sense of awkwardness. So how do you affect their overall calculus? I think that by engaging with them now, you have the opportunity to say, okay, we're ready to open the door to you. We're ready to give you a way out of this situation, so that they have an alternative. But make it very clear, as the chairman has suggested, that there are a whole range of requirements before they can be graduated from their rogue status to having a normal relationship with the United States.
And you believe the moment is ripe for that type of engagement, given
Yes.
there's a reasonable probability of an outcome that would lead to...
Right. I would say the moment will come with a new administration here, which is what the Syrians are essentially waiting for and positioning themselves for. But yes, then I think that there will be an opportunity.
Well, I think your comments are helpful in trying to, because I've always found it a peculiar dynamic because of the reasons you're stating, the sectarian dynamic within the country, and yet a friendship, partnership, alignment with Iran, given all of those other internal dynamics. So I appreciate your comments. It's helpful. Yes, sir.
I'd just like to point out here something, a complicating factor that I think need to be taken under consideration. I think Syria's relations with Iran at this stage is not that of partnership, but that of subservience. And I think the Iranians have a lot of influence, not only to dictate politics on Syria, but to undermine the regime if it went in a direction that is undesirable by her.
Can I stop you for a moment? How did that dynamic occur? What were the choices that led to that reality now?
Well, the relationship are long-standing. And at the same time, I think there is something that's very peculiar about Bashar's personality, Bashar al-Assad, the president, and his relationship with Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. And that allowed him to come into contact early on with the Iranian hardliners. And I think as time went on and Syria found itself more and more in trouble, the Iranians sort of gave them something to lean on. And the economic relationships have grown tremendously between the two countries. And Iran began advising especially over the last 3 years, the president of Syria on a lot of issues related to handling the crisis, the situation in Lebanon. So these last 3 years in particular have really been very important in the way Iran have managed to spread its influence in Syria. They've also manipulated the differences between the different members of the ruling family, in a sense. I know we are a republic, and yet we speak about the ruling family, and this is part of the tragedy we live in Syria. But that's in essence what happens. The president relies on his brother-in-law, his sister, and his maternal cousins to run the country. And I think the Iranians, but there are differences also between them. There are differences in temperament, visions, ambitions. So the Iranians have manipulated these things and have really endeared themselves to each member of the family. There is an agreement and a consensus that the relationship with Iran is important, but some members in the family want sort of a more equal relation, the kind that existed under Hafez al-Assad, where, you know, he was independent to make his decisions, but he also maintained this relationship with Iran. Bashar, on the other hand, is more under the sway of Ahmadinejad, basically, and the Iranian hardliners. And he favors more, and I think he felt really much comfortable when he sort of let the Iranians advise him and dictate the foreign policy over the last couple of years. And I think he felt that his Syria's position, in a sense, have had an edge over the United States over the last 2 years. So for all the talk about this isolation, inside their mind, really, there is a perception that they've actually managed to sort of reach some kind of a détente with this administration, and that this was the result of Iranian influence, and this was the result of their cooperation with Iran. And as a result, Bashar favors more such policies. And I think at this stage, what they did not realize, I think, is that Iran at this stage have really infiltrated the security apparatuses, the Republican Guard, and as such, they really hold a sway over the Assads.
Which, Mr. Chairman, if you could indulge me for a moment more, there's an irony in what you're saying, in that there's a growing willingness, desire to create certain distances from Iranian entanglement, and yet it is the Iranian influence that has allowed for the United States to become concerned, giving the Syrians a certain degree of leverage in terms of building perhaps a new relationship with us. There's real irony there.
It's a very strange relationship indeed.
If I understand what you said correctly.
Yeah, you're quite right. There are certain members of the family who feel this relationship has gotten too strong. And of course, the popular sentiment is completely uncomfortable with this relationship, simply because of the sectarian dimension it adds. There is a lot of talk on Shiaization. In fact, even official Muslim figures, and this is something that's unprecedented almost, they signed a letter complaining about the growing influence of Iran in the country. Even though they are not opposition, they are completely subservient to the regime, yet because they're Sunni and they were very sort of uncomfortable with how much leeway Iranians have to now spread their influence in the country, they've complained to the president publicly. So indeed, this relationship is problematic for the regime, but at the same time, it has they've sort of allowed it to take place for 3 years, and they did not realize how powerful the Iranians can actually, and how savvy they are. They've actually infiltrated different layers of society, businesses, the security apparatus. So it's not exactly now a question of Syria simply saying, we don't want that relationship anymore. I've made a comparison here between the relationship between Iran and Syria is rapidly becoming similar to the way Syria's relationship with Lebanon had been during the 1990s and before the withdrawal of Syrian troops. And as such, we might expect that if Iran's influence is going to be tamed or contained, that they might do what the Syrians are now doing in Lebanon, which is supporting all acts of mayhem inside the country. So that is the kind of dynamics that really needs to be taken also under consideration. It is not difficult. It's not that easy to think that this is something that the relationship can be sort of put on a back burner, and that while all these peace talks are taking place, that the Iranians will not be aware of the implications for their interests, and that they will not actually try to destabilize or the regime or play one Assad against another in order to get their way. In fact, this might have just taken place. A few weeks ago, there were a lot of rumors about the brother-in-law of the president, who is a very important person in the family and who holds the security in his hand, in a sense, being sort of sidelined. And I think all of this relates to the fact that Iran might be trying to sort of sideline a powerful figure within the Assad community so they can maintain their control of the more pliable figure, who is the president and his brother. So all of these dynamics are there and need to be taken under consideration.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing. I assume our Syrian counterparts would be watching this and would clearly understand that we are embracing a serious dialogue here as to clearly understand some of the problems, difficulties, and dilemmas in leading to what we all hope for, a more peaceful type of relationship that can build upon something positive and hopeful in the Middle East. Yet, at the same time, there are serious dilemmas and difficulties here. But I think, again, the hearing itself sends a clear statement that we look forward to potentially opening a door to address some of these internal dynamics, to address some of the external dynamics, and potentially lead to a new day here. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Carnahan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to also add my thanks to you for holding this hearing, and to the gentleman here on the panel. Thank you for being here. I wanted to ask a couple of questions with regard to the Syria-Lebanese relationship. And it has been clear that Syria has resisted efforts to clarify Lebanon's status, refusing to delineate borders, refusing to name an ambassador to Beirut, and refusing to negotiate with Beirut on the status of Lebanese being held in prisons. Is this just hard bargaining, positioning, or is there real deep-seated resistance to acknowledging the reality of Lebanese sovereignty and independence?
I think deep-seated resistance captures it quite well. The Syrian view of Lebanon is essentially as part of Greater Syria, that it was taken away from Syria by the imperialist powers, the British and the French, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And it's been continuous Syrian policy since then not to recognize the independence of Lebanon in exactly the way that you've suggested. There's a historical reason for that. There's a strategic reason for that. There's an economic reason for that. Syria views itself as a regional power, and it regards Lebanon as part of its sphere of influence. It had to withdraw its troops essentially because the Lebanese people came out into the streets and demanded that they go. But ever since then, the Syrians have used whatever means necessary, and I use those words purposely, whatever means necessary to exercise, promote their influence in Lebanon with an intention to control the situation there. We should have no illusions that they consider that a vital national interest for which they will be prepared to spend considerable political and, if necessary, military capital to maintain that interest.
Other gentlemen care to comment?
Indeed, I think the idea of simply not interfering in Lebanon is something that is it goes against the grain, the ideological grain, or also their financial interest as a family and as an elite. For this reason, I think this is the battle that's and the front on which they are going to fight the hardest. They are not going to give up that easy on Lebanon. In many ways, it's an existential issue because of the issue of the tribunal as well. And in many ways, it has something to do with pride, the way they've been driven out. It has something to do with how much they've lost in terms of financial investments, in terms of prestige, and these issues do count a lot in the culture. So this is going to be a tough fight, and this is why I suggested from the very beginning that the only way you can actually manage the situation is if you accepted that it's not simply one peace track that you have to have, but there has to be a parallel peace track also, not simply between Syria and Israel, but also between Syria and Lebanon. Because no one can stop the tribunal, and no one can sort of dictate a normalized relationship and how they should be from outside. The actors on both sides have to accept some kind of a compromise. If that is indeed possible. It may not be possible with the Assads, but we are saying perhaps we should try it before we will make that conclusion. But the Lebanese are the only one who can decide if they wanted to, if they got what they wanted from the Assad, which is full diplomatic recognition and an end of interference in their affairs and curbing Hezbollah. If they got that, they might be swayed, therefore, to ask the United Nations Supreme Security Council to reverse its decision regarding the tribunal. They are the only ones who can do that. No one else can do it. But they won't do it now, of course, and under these conditions. So this is therefore a parallel process that needs to take place. Otherwise, the situation will continue to be untenable. But it's not going to be easy. It's definitely not going to be easy. I doubt very much that the Assads will cooperate. In a sense, I'm very cynical about the possibility of success in any kind of engagement with the Assads. But I say we have to give it a final shot, and we have to lay out an element of conditionality. Martin has been very clear in making the sovereignty of Lebanon one condition, and I think, by suggesting this parallel peace process between Syria and Lebanon, I'm sort of saying how this could be taken further in order to achieve that. But the other conditionality I put is the internal situation, which is human rights improvement in the country, because the situation is really sizzling. Everything looks quiet at the surface, but underneath there are fires really about to erupt. So in order to also maintain the processes and the viability, somehow the internal situation needs to be put under control, and some kind of an internal reconciliation process need also to be sponsored. So we have three processes to worry about with regard to this affair: the Syrian-Israeli peace process, the Lebanese-Syrian peace process, and the internal Syrian national reconciliation. And if they don't go hand in hand, I think nothing will be achieved by any kind of engagement.
Thank you.
I agree with my colleagues. I would just add that Lebanon remains a big cloud over any potential Golan Heights negotiation, because I think, as we've discussed earlier, it's hard to imagine that Israel could get any assurance that Syria won't continue to use Lebanon subtly or unsubtly as a pressure point on Israel, even after a potential Golan agreement. And it's very hard to imagine dealing with all these issues comprehensively and getting any agreement in the present situation. So I'm not sure how you get out of this complexity.
I wanted to talk about the related issue of the special tribunal that, many expect to implicate top Syrian leaders for the murder of former Prime Minister Hariri and potentially other Lebanese political figures. If this happens, what implications do you think that has? Do you think Syria would cooperate? Do you think the international community would rally behind some kind of sanctions or group pressure?
If you ever get to this point, I think almost all bets are off in terms of engagement, because the regime will be presented with a set of names, perhaps of people to be tried, and they will be expected to offer them. So we might end up having a situation like the ones we had with Libya at one point. There will be a certain expectation by the international community for cooperation with the Assad, but the Assads will not be able to do that because that might represent an existential threat for them. In fact, the situation is far more complex than the one we had with Libya, where the people involved in the case of Libya were they were not so close to Gaddafi. On the other hand, here we might be talking about members of the family, if not the family in its entirety. So it's definitely an awkward situation. So we have to wait and see what kind of evidence that the tribunal will have, and what kind of witnesses or suspects that they are going to indict. Before we can even comment on that, but because if they named high people, level people, or ranking people, or one of the family members, I think the situation will call for isolation at that time, if not even confrontation. So and it might even happen if the next report or in 6 months came up with more concrete things to say and made the names public, then even before there is a next administration in the White House, we will have to deal with this situation. So this is the element of unpredictability here that really no one can do anything about.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is Syria capable of divorcing itself from Hezbollah?
The short answer is no. I think that the relationship between Syria and Hezbollah has moved from what was a tactical alliance under the former President Assad, Hafez al-Assad, who used Hezbollah as a means of both promoting Syria's influence in Lebanon and, more importantly, I think at that time, keeping the pressure on Israel via Lebanon to negotiate over the Golan. Syrians have never wanted to have a conflict over the Golan since the last war in 1973. The disengagement agreement negotiated by Henry Kissinger in 1975 essentially created a status quo that has existed with, I think, only one minor violation since then. Over 30 years, it's an extraordinary reality. And that's because the balance of military power has always been in Israel's favor, and the Syrians, especially after Egypt made peace with Israel, and after Saddam Hussein's military capability was significantly reduced, Syrians didn't have a military option, so they weren't prepared to fight over the Golan. That remains true to this day. But they were using Hezbollah against the Israeli army, which was in southern Lebanon, to put the pressure on Israel to negotiate over the Golan. So it served the tactical purpose for Hafez al-Assad. Of course, just before he died, the Israelis pulled out unilaterally from Lebanon. And then, as we know, the Lebanese people came out in support of Lebanese independence, demanded the Syrian troops withdraw, and Bashar al-Assad, the son, took them out of Lebanon. As a consequence, Hezbollah has become far more important, both for maintaining Syria's influence in Lebanon, since it's not there itself. Hezbollah's proxy capabilities are very important to Syria. And on a strategic level, as the military balance between Syria and Israel has grown even more imbalanced in Israel's favor, Hezbollah has served as a useful kind of strategic ally in terms of holding up an Israeli conventional advance on Damascus through the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. And so Syria has a strong interest in maintaining Hezbollah's military capabilities in a situation where it has to contemplate the potential for conflict with Israel. Peace between Israel and Syria could change both of those calculations, in particular the military calculation, because the security arrangements would and the peace commitments themselves would take away the concern that Israel might use military force against Syria. But still the desire to control the situation in Lebanon would make Hezbollah continuously important to Syria, especially if, as part of the deal, we demand Lebanon's independence is protected.
If I could probe that just a little further, a deal between Israel and Syria would require U.S. stewardship. It would seem to me that part of the ask on the part of the Israelis for the return of Golan would be the disappearance of Hezbollah from the Syrian agenda, and the insistence of the Syrians that Hezbollah no longer share the address of the Damascus of the government in Damascus. If that's part of the ask and give, would not the lack of support of Hezbollah accrue to the benefit of Lebanon and reduce Syria's ability to exert influence and control in Lebanon?
And therefore, why would it accept the deal, you're saying? And I think you're right that this is a complicating factor. I don't think it's a deal breaker, because there's a difference between the disarming of Hezbollah, which is required under the Taif Accords and all of the UN Security Council resolutions on Lebanon since 1559 was passed. It's not an Israeli demand only, it's a demand of the international community that Hezbollah be disarmed. But there's a difference between the disarming of Hezbollah and the removal of Hezbollah as a very important player in the politics of Lebanon. And what is happening is that Hezbollah has been able to use its military capabilities to promote its political influence in Beirut. It has one other particular advantage in the sense that it represents the Shia community, which is by now the largest community in Lebanon. But what I'm trying to say is that I could imagine a peace deal between Israel and Syria in which Hezbollah no longer has the ability to secure arms through the Syrian pipeline. The Syrian pipeline is cut. And there is a process within Lebanon of implementing that part of the Taif agreement that has never been implemented, which is the disarming of all militias, but now it means disarming Hezbollah. That would nevertheless result in Hezbollah retaining considerable influence in Lebanese politics, which would still play to the advantage of Syria. So that the maintenance of the military relationship between Syria and Hezbollah is not a necessary requirement for Syria to maintain its influence in Lebanon via Hezbollah. There is a political dimension which is already becoming more important and which could then be the most important way that they would promote their relationship.
Dr. Rodman, can you divorce the two? No.
Hezbollah in Syria. No, I don't. We talked earlier about how the context has changed from 15 years ago when Syria and Israel were talking. I'm not sure Syria could deliver on promises with respect to Hezbollah, and at the same time, I'm not sure how Israel and Syria could have a Golan negotiation without some discussion of Lebanon, and I'm not sure what is realistic to expect. Even with the best of goodwill on both sides over the Golan, I'm not sure how you realistically give Israel some assurance that Lebanon won't be used as a weapon against it. And I really agree with my colleagues that it's a very complex thing. I'm not sure Syria can, has total control, or Syria, for its own national or ideological reasons, can separate itself from Hezbollah.
Dr. Abdul-Mahdi.
I think just you have to factor in here also that the ability to disarm Hezbollah may not be something that Syria has without Iranian approval. So Iran is going to weigh in on this. It's not just simply a relationship between two sides. There is that third party that, in fact, is the puppet master, that is the stronger party, at least, that's dictating things to both Syria and Hezbollah, and their input into this have to be factored into the calculations.
Could I add one thing? Chairman?
Ambassador?
I think, again, in terms of principles here, the disarming of Hezbollah should be a Lebanese issue. The arming of Hezbollah is a Syrian issue because the arms are coming in through Syrian territory. So as part of the Israel-Syrian deal, there should be an end to that process of arming Hezbollah. And that's required by UN resolutions, and that would necessarily be part of the Israeli-Syrian deal because of the threat that Hezbollah poses to Israel's northern communities via Lebanon. But the disarming of Lebanon needs to be an internal Lebanese affair backed by the international community. And the resolutions for that, the UN resolutions already exist for that. But if the pipeline to Hezbollah was cut, the disarming of Hezbollah would be easier than in circumstances where it continues to enjoy that support from Syria and, of course, from Iran.
Mr. Inglis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here. I'm down here. So down the, it seems a long way away at the moment. I've missed much of this, but it occurs to me to ask about a more general question than maybe we've been discussing so far, and that is, how do you assist a group with terrorist backgrounds and terrorist tendencies and terrorist expertise in its transformation, if possible, to a reasonable participant in a democratic process. So in Northern Ireland, Sinn Féin went from, I guess through some process, isolated the terrorist elements and said, you can't participate, but we took the people that were, or whoever we is, some collection of people wisely got the other part to become part of a reasonable discussion in a democratic system. Hamas comes to mind in that way, and perhaps Hezbollah has some similar kind of possibilities in the future of isolating out the terror elements, the unhelpful folks, but capturing the passion with the political side. And how, if that's possible, if that's a desirable goal, how would the United States assist in that effort? You have any thoughts on how we might Sinn Féin, if that's a verb, the other similar groups that have bad histories but could be brought into the political process if they laid down their arms and if they decided to change their modus operandi?
The interesting thing about this comparison with Sinn Féin is that Hezbollah, or Hamas for that matter, have actually conducted, they represent both the military arm and the political arm. There was no division between, in Sinn Féin you had a division between the Irish Republican Army and Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin conducted politics and they said we had nothing to do with sort of what's going on in terms of the violence. They tried to create a distance. In the case of Hezbollah, no. They participated in politics in Lebanon. They ran candidates for elections. So they already know the political habits. The same thing as Hamas. They ran an election, they won the election. So they know they can do both things. They can do the military struggle and they can do the politics. So they already have the political savvy. What they don't have is the vision or the will, or what they don't see is that they have achieved what they wanted from the military aspect of their operations. If they can come to the point where they can see, okay, we've achieved what we wanted from the military operations, then that decision can be, they don't need to learn politics. They are already involved in it. So it just becomes a position of relinquishing their arms. In the case of Hezbollah right now, the reason they keep saying we need our arms is because they claim that we have not liberated all of the occupied lands by Israel yet. But if there was a peace between the three sides, Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, then that claim will be completely meaningless. And if there is a signed agreement between Lebanon and Israel, I mean, it's already really meaningless on the ground, but they're using it as an excuse. But if there is an agreement between Lebanon and Israel, then frankly, the reason to have arms will become null and void. So as such, they will have to relinquish it. And as I said, meanwhile, they are already picking up the political habits. They are already participating in elections. They are already they have ministers. They have members of parliaments. So for them and for Hamas, it's the same situation. So if they can get to an agreement with Israel, then they will be. I don't think they will disarm themselves in the sense that there will not be a Palestinian military, but they will join the regular military at some point. But for now, because the political goals have not been achieved, they operate on both levels.
I think that the other side of that coin is that when we promote elections, as the Bush administration has done in this part of the world, as a way of promoting democracy, we need to be very clear about one democratic principle that unfortunately the Bush administration has ignored. And it goes to the heart of your question. That principle is that there has to be a monopoly of force in the hands of the elected government. If terrorist organizations with their terrorist cadres and militias are allowed to compete in elections, then they enter the political process with their military capabilities intact. And that has a devastating impact on the ability of the government to actually control its territory. We saw it in Iraq. Exactly that thing happened. The problems we face in Iraq today are all about militias that have political parties that are in the government. We saw it in Lebanon, where the UN Security Council resolutions required that the Syrian troops withdraw and the Hezbollah give up its arms. And we decided instead to go for an election first, instead of insisting that Hezbollah disarm according to those Security Council resolutions. And as a result, Hezbollah has moved into the political process with its military capability intact, can provoke a war with Israel and take the government of Lebanon into a war with Israel that it didn't even deliberate about, and paralyze the Lebanese political system. And we saw it again with Hamas, where we insisted on an election, even though the Palestinian Authority and the government of Israel thought it was a bad idea. We insisted on it. We did not insist that Hamas disarm if it wanted to run in the elections. And it took power with its militia intact and then used its militia to launch a putsch against the Palestinian leadership in Gaza. So that's point number one in terms of answering your question, is what we have to do is insist on that democratic principle. Number two is that there has to be the will on the part of the leadership of these organizations, as there was with Sinn Féin, to give up the route of violence and to pursue their objectives by political means. We've allowed them to do both. And so, number one, we've got to change our stance, but they've got to be prepared to renounce violence, which Hezbollah is not yet willing to do. And the third thing is a process that takes place within these organizations that is in a sense inevitable. If they actually take government, then they do have to rule. Now, Hamas has taken control by force of Gaza, but it's in a dilemma now. Is it going to turn Gaza or maintain Gaza as a failed terror state, which is what it is now, or is it going to try to meet the needs of the people there, in which case it's going to have a ceasefire with Israel and get the passages open. And that process in itself has the potential, if the other factors are there, to move them from violence to politics. But the most important thing is we cannot allow them to continue violence and politics at the same time.
I agree with what Martin said about elections, but I would emphasize, I'd answer the question in a different way. You're right, there are a few successful examples of the domestication of an insurgent group. Sinn Féin is one, maybe Anbar province is another, Central America 20 years ago. But I think the key in every case was military pressure to demonstrate the futility of the military option, coupled with a political strategy that splits moderates, that co-opts moderates. If Hezbollah is the focus of your question, that we're a million miles away from demonstrating the futility of their military option. I mean, they think they won the war a couple of years ago, and they're arming themselves to the teeth for the next go-around. So, I mean, the good news in Lebanon is that there are a lot of other political forces in Lebanon that are very tenaciously and courageously resisting the blackmail pressure and so on. But I think without a change in the balance of forces, the military balance, Hezbollah is going to be a problem. I mean, they think they're on a roll, and if I were in their shoes, I wouldn't be making a whole lot of concessions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Inglis. far back as the 1990s, Syria participated in the U.S.-led coalition against Saddam Hussein, and for a time appeared to be willing to cooperate with the United States in our fight against al-Qaeda. But every time the U.S. concludes that Syria may be ready for a different kind of relationship, just like Lucy pulling the football away from Charlie Brown, Damascus proves unwilling. What do you suspect is behind this pattern of flirtation and rejection? These episodes of communication and failure to exploit opportunity, or are they more substantive reasons for the apparent breakdowns?
I think there's a simple explanation and a more complicated one. The simple explanation is they're just damn difficult to deal with.
Simple explanation of anything would be refreshing.
They're just very difficult people to do a deal with. The bizarre negotiations, I think, were probably invented in Damascus. It's got the oldest souk in the world, and they're doing deals with the Syrians is very, very difficult, complicated negotiation. Having said that, they do have a track record of living up to the requirements of the deal once the deal is made. But you can talk to Henry Kissinger or James Baker or Warren Christopher, all of whom had the dubious pleasure of making these multiple trips to Damascus to argue about the most minute details. It took an incredible effort on the part of our most senior statesmen to get the deal. Now, part of that, and now it becomes a little more complicated, part of it is because the Syrians like the process. They get something out of the process itself, which is the recognition, the prestige that comes from having the Secretary of State make 16 visits to Damascus. Damascus becomes the center of attention. And that's very important to them, I think, precisely because of something that Peter said. He put his finger on it, is that they essentially are playing a weak hand in terms of their resources, their capabilities. This is the way that they put themselves on a par with the other regional powers. And so that's why the process itself has advantages to them. Secondly, I think a better relationship with Syria often eludes us because they have other interests. For example, the U.S.-Syrian relationship in the 1990s, when we were heavily engaged with them over peace negotiations with Israel, the bilateral relationship between the United States and Syria really never went anywhere, despite their desire to see an improvement in the relationship and our willingness to go down that road. There was one huge rock in the road, which they were never willing to remove, and that was their sponsorship of terrorist organizations. And I could never really understand what was the advantage. I mean, if you put a relationship with the only superpower left in the world, and they once had a superpower patron to protect them, the Soviet Union, it was gone. You put on one side of the scales, a relationship with the United States, and on the other side of the scales, a relationship with Hamas and Palestine Islamic Jihad, or in those days it was PFLP and PDFLP and Habash and so on. Why would they want to maintain those relationships? And yet they were never prepared to act against them. And that, I think, is because the Syrians see themselves, have this self-image as the beating heart of pan-Arabism, the supporter of national liberation movements, the opponents of occupation, whether it be Israeli or American. And that is an important part of their identity and their ability to promote themselves both within Syria and beyond Syria in the Arab world. It served both purposes. And don't forget, you're dealing with a minority regime that in a sense has to be more Sunni than the Sunnis in terms of promoting the Sunni Arab cause, precisely because they're not Sunnis. And more Sunni than the Sunnis because they have this relationship with Iran, which serves their interests as well. And so, as a color, we could go in and talk again about the relationship with Iran, but we've already dealt with that, as another constraining influence on the ability to have a normal relationship with the United States.
Alternative views or?
No, I think that is really a very good. The last point of the explanation when he looked at the minority issue and in the sense that the Assads really have to be more Sunni than the Sunnis and more Arabs than the rest of them, even though they are maintaining, or because in fact they are maintaining this relationship with Iran and because they are not Sunnis themselves. I think that is really a key factor. The other thing is that they are in the process of establishing a dynasty in a republican system. You know, it's throughout the 1990s, that transitional issue was very important and key. So Assad Senior did not want to do anything to jeopardize his son's chances of reaching of succeeding him in power. And a lot of his focus was on that, really. And I think everything else was filtered through this prism. And this is sort of an important issue to note. And this is why it's so difficult for any kind of engagement to be successful with the Assads. You can present them, and as Martin said, with the best case scenario of everything, and yet they will still drag their feet simply because they want to maintain an untenable situation, which is their control over a country that is growing gradually restless under them and that is really about to reject them. And they want to find a way of trying to keep that thing under control. And the best way is to exploit their problems. The best way is to keep on playing the nationalist cause and to keep on supporting these groups out there.
Dr. Rodman?
No, I agree with what my colleagues have said. I think this is this spoiler role is the essence of Syria's foreign policy. It enables them to play a major regional role way beyond what their inherent resources and strength would warrant. It's what got them Soviet weapons for many years and even now Russian weapons. I mean, and it's their ability to intimidate their Arab brothers. So, I mean, it's hard to imagine them giving all that up and then becoming a very ordinary little country, even with the Golan Heights.
Should we be drawing red lines in the sand, or is that, and announce what consequences might be of crossing those lines, or is that too dangerous a proposition, especially if there are no consequences? And if it was appropriate to do that, what would those red lines be?
I'm not sure what you exactly have in mind. I think that there are certain red lines that have been drawn that the Syrians respect, and they're very, in fact, you know, this is the upside of dealing with them. They do respect red lines. They do calculate. Sometimes they miscalculate. Assad is more prone to miscalculation than his father. But they do calculate the balance of power like computers, you know. And they have a real sense of how far they can go. Sometimes they'll test it, but they do. They certainly respect Israel's red lines. And that means, you know, not creating problems on the Golan and not provoking conflict with Israel. By the same token, Israel, respects the Syrian red lines. The Syrians appear to have crossed an Israeli red line when they appear to have built this clandestine nuclear reactor, and the Israelis took care of that. But the Israelis were very careful not to embarrass the Syrians, and have been very careful to signal the Syrians that they're not interested in a conflict with Syria. And the Israeli-Syrian understanding of red lines has, I think, developed in the last couple of years in a quite sophisticated way, way that existed under Rabin and Assad. But
was there any embarrassment or humiliation on the part of the Syrians? You say the Israelis were careful not to do that, but
well, the answer is no, because the Israelis did not expose them, and the Israelis are actually very concerned that this briefing today that's appeared in the newspapers this morning will cause the Syrians to feel embarrassed, and the Israelis are very concerned that this is going to lead to increase in tension. I suspect it's part of the reason why you have the leaking of the story that the Israeli Prime Minister has offered to give up the Golan Heights, because that's a way, if the Golan Heights are on the table through negotiations, why do we need to respond to an Israeli attack?
Would you think they'd be more concerned that the Syrians would be embarrassed, or more pleased that the Iranians would be forewarned?
I think the Iranians got the message without having to embarrass the Syrians, to expose to the Syrians. I mean, the word came out, but the Israelis were not responsible for exposing it. Whereas what's happening in the press stories today, is stories about Israeli intelligence that has been provided to the United States, and there the Israelis, are put in the position of appearing to have broken their code of silence in this regard.
Let me ask you a different question. The administration has clearly made a decision to leak this, and was so determined to do so that they couldn't trust Congress to do it after our briefing. What is the benefit to the administration of doing this now? Is there any speculation at this point?
Yeah, it is speculation, but I think that the answer lies in the North Korean file rather than the Syrian file. That there's clearly a discussion going on within the administration about what is required of the North Koreans in terms of full disclosure, and whether they can accept a statement from the North Koreans, which is, we didn't do it, but we'll never do it again, as opposed to coming clean on what they actually did. And so that's my speculation, is that those who are insisting that the North Koreans come clean are taking advantage of the Congress's desire to know what the hell happened here, to put out the word about what the North Koreans were up to.
Should one suspect that this is a mechanism of the neocons within the administration, which do not want to see the administration moving forward with North Korea on something that might be reasonable or Clinton-esque?
I wish that were the case. I think this is just the intelligence community. I think it's just a sort of reflex action to put the stuff out, and the intelligence community is not responsive to political pressures of this kind. Certainly, I mean,
yes,
I believe there are people.
But you would not say that they are not politically motivated.
But I don't think the intelligence community shares the skepticism about the North Korean negotiation. That's what's puzzling to me. I mean, I'm very skeptical of the North Korean negotiation, and but I suspect the people leaking it are not of that stripe, so I find it puzzling. And my speculation is that this may have more innocent motives, you know, and it just, so it may be too much to read some devious motivation in there, because I think the people responsible for the leaking are not the kind of people who would be opposed to the North Korean negotiation. I'm not sure there's anybody left in the government that is opposed to this North Korean negotiation.
I think they have secret cells.
I'm not commenting on that.
But I, just to finish on your red lines question, I think I got diverted into talking about Israeli-Syrian red lines, but I think that we have tried very hard to put down a red line on the Lebanese-Syrian border, and to tell the Syrians, you have no business interfering in Lebanon, and we won't accept it.
What does it mean when we say we will not accept? I've heard that so much from the administration,
yeah.
When they say this is not acceptable.
Yeah. Well,
there are no consequences. Are they really saying this is not acceptable, but we don't know what to do about it?
Well, there are consequences. They are saying it's not acceptable. The consequences are coming through UN Security Council resolutions, UN Security Council reports to the UN Security Council, efforts to bolster the Lebanese government, efforts to keep Arab leaders from going to an Arab summit in Damascus. But what's happening here, Mr. Chairman, is that there is basically a tussle going on, a conflict going on between the United States, Saudi Arabia, and more broadly the UN on the one side, and the Syrians, Iranians, Hezbollah on the other, for the future of Lebanon. So the red line has not yet been established or accepted. But I think you can understand it as that's what's going on here. And the Syrians, the strange situation where the Syrians actually should have been satisfied with the Lebanese candidate that the government put up. The May 14th movement put up a pro-Syrian candidate in this General Suleiman. And the Syrians have blocked that. I don't think there's they're really making any attempt to hide the fact that they're blocking that. Because, number one, I think they felt that their opponents in Lebanon blinked. And they blinked, and therefore, they don't need to relieve the pressure on them. And number two, and more importantly, because this has the effect of paralyzing Lebanese politics. And so as long as there's no president, it becomes very difficult for the political system to function there. And of course, we're doing everything we can to get the Syrians to go along with the appointment of what in effect would be a pro-Syrian president. So in that respect, I don't think the red lines have yet been established, but I don't think it's fair to say or it's accurate to say that there have been no consequences for Syria. The international community, and particularly the United States, France, and Saudi Arabia, have tried to impose a price on Syria, but the Syrians have a willingness to absorb the costs, partly because they're not that great, and partly because they have an intense interest, as we've already discussed.
I suppose you make those kinds of decisions when the benefits exceed the costs. Dr.
I don't know if would it be too naive of me to propose human rights or political dissidents as a red line. In a sense, the current regime is already trespassing against this red line, and but in a way, we are in a good position because seeing how bad the relationships are between the United States and Syria, a mere act of sending the ambassador back and therefore a resumption of normal relations or a semblance of normal diplomatic relations might in itself be a reward should the ruling regime in Syria release the political prisoners, abide by that red line. So normal diplomatic relations will be based on knowing that you are dealing with a regime that is trying to at least maintain a semblance of legitimacy with its own people by not imprisoning human rights activists and opponents and dissidents. And this is really what I'm hoping to achieve, and what my colleagues tomorrow who will be speaking here in the conference are hoping to achieve is a message that human rights should be a red line in the case of Syria, that dissidents should be a red line. We know this is somewhat naive or idealistic, but we are trying to say that the situation in Syria has grown so bad in this regard that not doing something about it is going to make it grow worse to an extent where the situation could actually erupt in violence, and we don't want to see that. So it could be establishing this as a red line and beginning the process of engagement with the Syrian regime with this precondition and promise a return of an ambassador in exchange for releasing the political prisoners. That might be the beginning of an engagement that could help legitimize the Syrian government somewhat in the eyes of the international community and in the eyes of its own people, and as such it could help engagement down the road on all of these other issues as well.
You mentioned naive and unrealistic, which brings up the topic of President Carter. His visit to Damascus, did that have a positive effect on human rights, a negative effect on human rights, or was it totally insignificant?
Like every visit by former, by congressional people sometimes, or by foreign delegates, it really sort of it had a negative effect, because the regime saw in this attempt at reaching out sort of a legitimization of its own position, and instead of rewarding their demands, because I know President Carter did ask for privately for the release of certain people from prison, and I don't think it's going to go anywhere, because the usual response is, that has always been given, that they have to ask for pardon, and we will release them. In other words, they are telling the opposition members and the dissidents that they have to actually beg for forgiveness. We've made a mistake by insisting on our rights. We want to be forgiven. And of course, the dissidents are not going to do that, so they remain in prison. So, and in fact, every visit was oftentimes followed up by even a more tightening of the security conditions and more arrests. So unfortunately, for all the good intentions that I know President Carter had, and I know a lot of that Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi had, and among others, I don't really think that the visit sent a good message at this stage. I prefer to see, first of all, an element of conditionality before these kind of attempts at reaching out develop. And as I said, there is something the Syrians want from this. And so long that you are saying we are willing to engage, but you have to make yourself somewhat more legitimate in our eyes in order to do so, then this will be a starting point. But to engage before you even, in the hope of obtaining some concessions from them, with the Assads, it doesn't work, because they'll see it as a reward and a justification of their hardline position. And you know, we can point to all of these previous incidents in this regard, so this is not a speculation on my part.
I would just say for the record that there have been many visits, including that of the Speaker, that of former Chairman Lantos, and such as several that I've made myself to Damascus, were basically to deliver strong messages, which included the message of human rights. And we thank you especially, Mr. Abdul Mohammed, for injecting that into today's discussion. Dr. Rodman, did you want to add something?
You asked about red lines. I think the missing ingredient has always been effective pressures on Syria. I mean, I remember Lebanon diplomacy 25 years ago. We were looking around, what pressure points do we have on Syria? And we never have enough to really impose our will. And right now, after the Hezbollah war of 2006, even Israel, which has the most leverage on Syria, is in a mixed position as far as having leverage. I mean, the balance of forces is what's key here, and that we have strengths and weaknesses, and that will determine the outcome of negotiations. I agree with you about the engagement or the visits. I mean, I can testify again from personal experience. I was in a high-level delegation in 2004 with Bill Burns of the State Department. We went to meet with President Assad to talk about Iraq, what they were doing in Iraq and what they were doing in Lebanon and so on. And we delivered what I thought were very ferocious talking points, but the Syrians are masters of spin. And the Syrians use the fact of these visits as evidence. They say, we have excellent relations with the Americans. Look at all these high-level visits. So it doesn't matter how blunt you are in conversation, they'll publicize it and spin it as, showing that they're free of pressures. What we may think is a way of ratcheting up pressures by delivering a tough message, they will spin it into a form of relief from pressures. So that's, again, the balance of forces is going to convey a message more effectively than talking points.
Could
if I might just follow up on that, I actually have a written staff-prepared question that talks to that very point that might be appropriate here. And it goes like this. In your testimony, you contrast the tough talking points with which you went to Damascus, talking points that in your testimony you noted were cleared by the president himself, with the Syrian spin that what mattered was the high-level delegation. The question is, what was the follow-up when the Syrians ignored your tough talking points? Was the problem the high-level visit or the lack of consequences for Damascus failing to heed the warnings of your delegation?
There really was no or else. I mean, Donald Rumsfeld always used to say, what's the or else? And there wasn't any, and the Syrians figured this out. Now, ironically, there was some fratricide among different objectives. When the UN Special Tribunal was created, I think that inhibited us. We were ratcheting up American sanctions on Syria, but for a couple of years we held back, thinking, there was a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. There would be international sanctions as a result of this investigation, and therefore we didn't want to do anything to screw that up. So we held back, and so we were paralyzed for a few years by this inhibition. Now, I'm glad to see that in the last few months, I think the administration has resumed the process of ratcheting up economic sanctions on Syria. Because the UN process, even though we support it, is glacial in its progress. But I think that's always been the problem, that you put your finger on it. What's the follow-up? What's the or else? What's the price they pay? And that's been the missing ingredient, not engagement. I mean, the missing ingredient is not that we haven't had enough dialogue or not that we haven't talked to them enough. And it's pressures.
I have a lot of sympathy for Ammar's approach as a way of getting human rights onto the agenda of the bilateral discussion. But how do you get it on the agenda if you don't have the discussion? Is the conundrum here, and it's a difficult one. Amar suggests that this be the precondition for sending our ambassador back. But the purpose of having an ambassador there is precisely to deliver these kinds of messages, and to maintain relationships with Syrians who are advocating for human rights, and to report on the conditions in Syria. So that there are, to condition our having an ambassador there on the change of their behavior in this regard is I think to use the wrong lever. It's much too small a lever to make a difference. But the presence of the ambassador could actually, I think, help the agenda more.
You would send an ambassador?
Yes, I think we should send our ambassador. But I don't think we should make a big deal about having an ambassador there. I think we need an ambassador there precisely because an ambassador can press this agenda as well as give us a better sense of
that argument
what's
apply
going
to
on.
Iran as well?
Well, the Iranians won't allow us to have an ambassador there. But it's a real, I will tell you, Mr. Chairman, it's a real problem with Iran. We haven't had any kind of official relations with Iran for more than 3 decades. We don't have a feel for what's a direct feel for what's going on there. And if we don't have a good feel for it, how can we develop an effective policy?
I guess we'd have to have an ambassador who could clear his calendar for 444 days.
Yes, also to be prepared for congressional visits.
Well, does anybody have anything brilliant to say that has not already been said? Because you have exceeded certainly my expectations and that of the rest of the committee. If not, we will reserve our right to delightfully invite you back on another day to continue to help us during our deliberations and with our education and trying to answer some of our probing remaining questions to these difficult problems that we see. So I thank this very distinguished panel for your patience, your participation, and your expertise. Thank you very much. Hearing stands adjourned.